Apenas ahora yo empiezo a grabar también entonces. Empiezo al tiro.
Yeah, basically now you're the main one that I can hear, Tarek. The others are now much more muted, but I'm done. Okay, go.
Daniel, sorry. No puedo grabar no puedo grabar contigo. I don't know why.
No, now I can hear you, Monica.
¿Tú, Fernanda, tú puedes? ¿Cómo están? Muy buenas tardes. Son las 8:06. Estamos ahí, unos pequeños problemas técnicos con la grabación para que después podamos disfrutar todo después de ella. Si es que no se va a poder grabar en inglés, el original, no se preocupen, va a estar al menos en español que se está grabando. Los saludos, muy buenas tardes, Daniel Halpern. Estamos felices de poder estar hoy día junto a ustedes. Tenemos está Mónica Nelson del Colegio Grange, justo a Fernanda Areste, también de los colegios Lintac, y más importante, ¿no es verdad? Al final dejamos la presentación a nuestro querido Nicolás Kardaras, Dr. Kardaras. Dejen decir dos palabras para introducirlo, junto dicen no se escucha. Dejen explicarles entonces. Ustedes van a tener un mundo ahí abajo que son que se llama del lenguaje. Si ustedes quieren escuchar, deben hacerlo en español, que me están escuchando a mí. Y después, cuando el profesor Nicolás Kardaras hable, él va a hablar en inglés, pero ustedes van a escucharlo muy despacito en inglés y van a escuchar la voz de la persona que va a estar haciendo la traducción, el intérprete, también en español. Entonces, eso es un poco la estructura. Ponen ahí el mundito en el idioma, lo ponen para que cuando el doctor hable, ustedes puedan escucharlo en español. Y la idea es tener alrededor entre 50 minutos y una hora del doctor conversando y posteriormente preguntas para que ustedes hagan a través del chat y Mónica y Fernanda nos van a ayudar para poder entregárselas al profesor. Dos cosas entonces para presentarlo. Él tiene un TED, no sé si ustedes lo pueden ver o lo han visto, lo quieren ver después, que se llama Volviendo de la muerte, donde él habla sobre una experiencia que tuvo con una sobredosis y cómo después decidió su vida dedicarla a lo que hoy día está haciendo, que es la rehabilitación, ayudar a personas que tienen adicciones, y también comentarles que afortunadamente él cuenta ya con 2 centros que han ayudado a miles de jóvenes, y debe ser quizás humilde, pero debe ser quizás una de las personas que más sabe y entiende del área de adicción digital. Realizó un libro que fue éxito en ventas, que se llama Glow Kids. Glow es como resplandeciendo, ¿no es verdad? Que los niños, el reflejo en la pantalla, en lo personal, fue hace ya 4 años. Fue uno de los libros que primero me leí y que cambió gran parte de mi percepción frente a este fenómeno, y está preparando La locura digital. Este libro que habla. Entonces, sin más, les quiero dejar a nuestro querido invitado de hoy, agradecerle a cada uno y una de ustedes por estar acá, por tomarse el tiempo y obviamente por querernos, ¿verdad?, tener una familia, una relación, hijos, hijas, con un mejor bienestar, que es el objetivo de todos. Así que, querido Nicolás, te dejo para que puedan todos conversar contigo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for introducing me and for asking me to be on as a guest, to have a conversation, to share some of the insights that maybe I've gotten about this issue. And look how amazing this is, right? We're using technology in such a, here we are halfway around the world from each other, and we're able to communicate effectively, well, hopefully effectively, depending on how the technology stands up. And yet we're also, what we've seen with technology, we've seen in the United States, what we would call the double-edged sword. We've seen the good aspects of technology. We've seen technology that's been able to upheal people and medical advances and just amazing phenomenon. Even our communication devices, our smartphones, as strictly digital or strictly inventions of the modern age, are phenomenal. It's an amazing use of innovation and science, but we weren't, I think most of us weren't aware or were underaware when we first started really immersing ourselves in this digital age. And it's been really fairly recent when we look at who we are as a species over evolutionary time frame over the last 10 to 15 years, which is the blink of an eye evolutionarily. We've entirely changed as a society. We've changed in terms of how we communicate, how we interact interpersonally. We've changed how our children grow up and develop. And many of us, I think, part of the issue that I think happened with some of the darker aspects of technology that have crept up on us as a society was because people, our generation or my generation, I'm probably a little bit older than, at least I'm older than most of my hosts that have invited me to speak here. I think one of the mistakes that we did was we conflated or we equivocated modern screens with television. And many of us were raised on television. And while there were some potential warnings about the effects of television going back to the 1960s and 70s and the 80s, we didn't fully appreciate the qualitative difference of modern screen time. We didn't fully appreciate how the modern screen would be so much more impactful psychologically and from an emotional well-being to our society. And the main reason why modern screens are more impactful and more problematic potentially is two reasons primarily. They're immersive and interactive in ways that television never were. When I was a young boy growing up watching television, and when most of us grew up watching television, we would watch as passive viewers of a screen experience. Who would, the television typically would be in our living room or wherever it was in our house, and we would watch it from a few feet away. So we were passive viewers of a digital experience. Now the modern screen world is immersive. In other words, you're in the experience. And so it's an interactive and immersive experience, which makes it much more powerful psychologically. And we didn't fully appreciate what that meant. We didn't fully appreciate what does it mean to be fully immersed in a digital environment. And I think the problem was most of us, the adults in the room, we fell so in love with our technology. I myself was raised on science fiction. I was raised on Star Trek, the television show. I was raised reading science fiction, Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. So as a young man, I grew up believing that technology could be part of the solution of the problems of the modern world. And so I was what you would call a tech utopianist. I believe that the future utopia of mankind or humanity can be enabled through technology. And then unfortunately, some of the realities hit and we started realizing that maybe it wasn't all going to be a wonderful, beneficial experience. And we started seeing with young people in particular, some increased psychiatric issues. So just to put it in perspective, now most of the world has gone through COVID. Over the last 2.5 years, most of the world has gone through this amplification of screen dependence. So in the age of coronavirus, we've seen quarantines and isolation and Zooming and remote schooling. And the statistics are, the one main statistic that I'd like to point out, during COVID, we've had a doubling of screen time and we've seen depression has tripled. And we've known through the clinical research that the more you're in front of a screen, especially for younger people, the higher the rates of depression. And what we had been seeing over the last 20 years was rates of depression were skyrocketing. And so depression kept growing. We saw that depression before the pandemic in 2019, according to the World Health Organization, over 300 million people were diagnosed as clinically depressed. And it was the #1 chronic debilitating illness in the world was and is depression. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves, because we've tripled the amounts of antidepressant medication that we're prescribing, and yet depression still keeps rising. And so we know that depression isn't just a byproduct of a neurochemical imbalance. And we have to start looking at what we would call environmental factors for depression. What is making us as a species more depressed? And when you look at depression rates globally, and a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Ilardi, looked at depression rates globally, he found something very interesting. He found that the most well people, the least depressed people in the world, were pre-industrial societies. Low technology societies had the lowest rates of depression. And so these were the Kalului in Papua New Guinea, some tribes in South America, in the Amazon, some African tribes, but indigenous peoples tended to have almost zero rates of depression. And what was interesting to Dr. Ilardi and to myself was, why do quote unquote primitive people seem to not be depressed when they have extremely difficult lives? Some of these peoples that Dr. Ilardi studied over the last 15 years had, well, these were hunter-gatherer cultures, so they had just day-to-day survival was a struggle, and yet they had very, very low depression rates. In fact, when they studied in New Guinea, when they studied the Kalului, they studied over 2,000 Kalului tribesmen for over a 10-year period, and not one of them was clinically depressed. So the question was, what's happening that's making people that don't have technology be depression immune? And those of us that have all the modern marvels of the technological era, we seem to not be very well psychiatrically. So let me check that off. In 2019, before COVID, before coronavirus, we had the highest rates of depression. We had the highest rates of, and now I'm speaking for the United States, which is my field of expertise. In the United States in 2019, we had the highest suicide rates, the highest depression rates, the highest overdose rates, the highest anxiety rates, the highest ADHD rates in recorded history. And suicides, we had over 42,000. Overdoses, we had over 70,000 fatal overdoses. In coronavirus, those overdoses rose to over 100,000. And so we were not very well as a species, as a society. We were struggling with our psychiatric mental health. And one of the narratives that I like to speak about is we can't just look at tech addiction, because in the United States, there was a big debate about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I wrote my book, Glow Kids. The psychological community had a debate whether there is even such a thing called tech addiction. Can you become addicted to your smartphone, your iPad, your any kind of technology platform? And that debate has already been answered now. Certainly people, I think we all understand, and clinically now there's an official diagnosis for internet gaming disorder as of this January in the International Classification of Diagnosis, according to the World Health Organization. Now we finally have tech addiction as an official diagnosis. But now the bigger question is, what is our habituation or our love affair with technology doing to our species and our mental health? Forget the question about whether my son or my daughter are on their computer for too much or on their telephone for too long. It's what is that time on their computer or the telephone doing to them? What is the effect of that overuse? And so that's when we begin to look at some issues like I mentioned before, the mental health metrics that we talked about, increased rates of depression, anxiety. We've seen pedagogical, in other words, educational impacts. We've seen a whole host of new psychiatric disorders that I've written about in my new book that I'll discuss also, because what we're seeing is that social media is a very powerful thing. And social media, and I'll get into this shortly in my talk in more detail, but social media and the promise of social media as this great connector of the globe, social media was supposed to unite all of us, has also become the carrier for certain, it's a viral carrier for certain psychiatric disorders. So we're seeing things or platforms like TikTok and Instagram spreading everything from or amplifying eating disorders, Tourette's syndrome, personality disorders like borderline personality disorders are being amplified or caused by social media in young people. We're seeing certain psychiatric disorders in young people that we've never seen in the last 10 years. And these are all new phenomena. These are all new gifts of the digital age. So I just want, that was sort of my little bit of an overview is to begin to understand what does a social species look like that's become too dependent on technology that essentially makes us sedentary, less connected, more isolated, more meaning devoid, because as human beings, we're all primed to want to have meaning and purpose in our life. It was mentioned before that earlier in my life, I had struggled with my own addiction, and I had an overdose and a near-death experience. And I believe that, one of the problems with maybe our society, maybe with our young people, is we're struggling to find meaning in a very information overloaded, in a very overwhelming world. And so what does a 16-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 22-year-old do in a landscape where there's information constantly coming at them, but perhaps they feel their own lives don't make any sense to them? What does that begin to look like? And what does the emptiness begin to look like? And a lot of the young people that I work with, they'll say the number one issue that they're struggling with, besides depression, is a sense of emptiness, a sense of not really feeling a sense of belonging. So I want to share my screen, if I may. And I'd like, before I want to share something that's a little bit, I think, informative and entertaining. There's a friend of mine back in the United States, is a pretty well-known comedian. Her name is Paula Poundstone, and she does a very, I think, effective, brief 2-minute overview that she did for CBS News about what might be some of the issues with screen time with young people. And I'd like to share that with you if I can for a moment. Give me a moment here.
Almost everyone in our country is addicted to electronics and riddled with denial. When I talk to people about it, they get defensive. They say it's not addiction, it's just something they enjoy. Really? I love to play ping pong. I love to practice the drums. I love to tap dance, but I have never even once tried to.
We're all in this together, learning.
Apologies.
Together. And it's the perfect place for you to grow as an educator. My name is Caitlin.
Once tried to figure out how to do any one of those things while driving in such a way as that the cops couldn't see. Because I am not addicted to those activities, I just enjoy them. And there's a huge difference. Screen devices wreak havoc with the brain's frontal lobe. Diagnoses of ADHD in our children have taken a steep rise since the proliferation of screen devices. Yet, even when presented with that information, parents often won't hear of protecting their kids from the harmful effects of screen devices. Kids love them, they say. Yes, they do. And some kids would love heroin if we gave it to them. I'm told that after the initial vomiting stage, it could be a hoot. We didn't know this when we first brought these shiny new toys into our homes, but now we do know. Still, adults aren't doing anything about it. Why? Because we're addicted. Addiction hampers judgment. You see it. Everywhere you look, people are staring at their flat things. We're terrified of being bored. No one drifts or wonders. If Robert Frost had lived today, he would have written, "Whose woods are these? I think I'll Google it." Screens are tearing away our real connections. Ads for family cars show every family member on a different device. Applebee's, Chili's, Olive Garden, and some IHOPs are putting tablets on their tables. These restaurants claim they are providing tablets just to make ordering easier. Well, gee, if saying, "May I please have chicken fingers," is too difficult for our young ones, wouldn't we want to work on that? The tech industry has profited from the "every child must have a laptop in the classroom" push, but education hasn't. Research shows that the brain retains information better read from paper than from a screen. And students who take notes by hand are more successful in tests than those who type their notes on a computer. Yet art, music, sports, play, healthy meals, and green space, things we know help the developing brain, are on the chopping block of school districts' budgets annually. Even knowing this, at the suggestion that we get screen devices out of our classrooms and away from our children, people gasp. But they'll need them for the world of the future. Our children will need fully functioning brains for the world of the future. Let's put that first.
And that was Paula Poundstone. And thank her for her work with that for a moment while I go back to my one moment.
Figure out how to do any.
So I was talking before about our love affair with technology. And one interesting thing that we've seen was a phenomenon that many of us experience, I think, as adults, forgetting even the impact on our children. But how many of you in the audience have experienced a sense of discomfort or a sense of anxiety when you've forgotten your phone, or when you see your battery levels are running low? Well, there's a word for that. It's called nomophobia. And nomophobia is the irrational fear of being without your phone for any period of time. And it comes from the two words, no mobile phone. And actually, interestingly, in Brazil, the psychology department at Rio de Janeiro's Federal University started the Delete Institute back in 2013. And they had started developing exercises to help people become more comfortable with being not with their telephones. The question we have to ask ourselves is, if we, the adults who have more developed sense of impulse control and more developed brains, are beginning to get challenged by our devices, we have to ask ourselves, how challenging is this for our children? So I think we have to kind of go back to understand, what is it about technology itself that is so fundamentally attractive or seductive or appealing to us as a human species? And we can break that down to, I think, three fundamental primal drives that we as human beings have had hardwired into us as a species. Number one, evolutionarily, we've been designed for connection. There's an old saying that they use in sociology: the tribe survived. We as human beings were not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we're arguably the most intelligent, but left alone to our own devices in prehistoric times, we wouldn't have survived if we didn't learn how to work in a communal setting. So being able to work together socially in a tribe led to our survival. So we have a genetic predisposition towards connection, towards working together. So the digital seduces us with the promise of connectivity, but as we'll see, it's a little bit of a false promise, because it's not genuine connection in the way that we really need it. So if you look at our drawings here, the bottom left drawing, that's the first social network. It's a few people banding together to connect, to stay alive. The second thing that technology tickles in us is our need to explore and discover. Now, that's called neophilia, the love of the new. We're evolutionarily born as explorers, because that also kept us alive. We learned how to discover things. We learned how to make fire, how to make tools, how to discover new agricultural methods to stay alive. And so we're also hardwired to want to not only explore, but also to see what's over the horizon. So the digital age presents us with so many things to explore. And one of the types of tech addiction that I work with is people who have hyperlink addiction, people who can't stop reading political story after political story, news story after news story, or keep scrolling because there's just always another thing to discover over the digital horizon. The third psychological need that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of why we're so in love with our technology is our need for what we might call archetypal experiences. And some of you may or may not know, but an archetype is a deep, profound, cross-cultural symbol or a way of understanding the world. And so the classic archetype is the hero's journey. And so many of us are thirsty for those kinds of symbols that we used to get through our mythology, through our folklore, through our storytelling, through our narratives, through our fictional stories. They feed our soul in ways that are very necessary. They help us understand the world through these archetypal figures. But the modern digital age has demystified a lot of the world. A lot of the world has gotten very, as Carl Jung had said, has been demystified. And so young people who are still thirsty for a sense of that kind of hero's journey we'll find it in a video game, because most video games, if you really study how they're designed and how they're set up, they are the classic hero's journey. The hero's journey is defined as an adventure, as a protagonist who has to overcome certain obstacles to achieve their desired goal. And then when they achieve that goal, they get to the other side of their whatever hurdles they've had to overcome, they become more empowered and more powerful and stronger. And most video games that our children play, or our boys mostly play, are hero's journeys that make you feel a sense of empowerment. So when you look back also historically, technology, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up on Star Trek, was presented to us as the promise of a utopian future. And this was a Newsweek cover story from 1996. And it said, you see the very happy, smiling young girl on the cover of the magazine. And the question was, can PCs make your kid a better student? And this is an optimistic look at what can a tablet or a laptop do for a child in their education. Well, 16 years later, Newsweek ran a very different cover story. They ran this cover story: I crazy, panic, depression, psychosis. After 16 years, the experiment of our children being overloaded with technology, we started seeing some of the mental health effects that Newsweek wrote about in that story. So the more we've immersed ourselves in technology, the more unwell we've seen our young people become. And it's led to a teenage mental health crisis. And there, you see the picture in this slide, the zombie apocalypse. I'm sure you've all seen it in your communities. Young people with their heads down, immersed in their devices, not looking up, not playing sports, not socializing in the way that we were all meant to evolve. But what is the mental health price for that? So we've led children and teenagers and young adults down the path of crisis, and they're asking for help. Because as I said earlier, this is the worst time for mental health for young people. The metrics are at an all-time high, and they only became worse during the coronavirus pandemic. One of the interesting statistics regarding screen time, and this is screen times with younger children, the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics had a really fascinating study in 2019. Children from at the very vulnerable age of between 3 and 5, they found that if they were on the computer for more than an hour a day of unsupervised screen time, they started having developmental issues with the parts of their brains devoted to cognitive development. And according to the lead author of the study, this is the first study to document the association between screen use and lower measures of brain structure and skills in preschool age children. That was the lead author, Dr. John Hutton. This is important because the brain is developing the most rapidly in the first 5 years. So here we've been, as a society, many of us will look and we'll see parents who, in strollers, they'll have 18-month-old, 2-year-olds with a computer in their hands under the false idea that giving an infant a screen is somehow educational or beneficial. And when now we're beginning to see more and more, the research is showing quite the opposite, that screen time is doing damage. The one, I'm not going to go into all 4 of these boxes. I want to sort of zero in on the more important highlights, but the last box on this slide, the bottom box, I think is a very important one. Teens' use of electronic devices for at least 5 hours daily is more than doubled from 2009 to 2015. So this is the critical part of this sentence. These teens were 70% more likely to have suicidal thoughts or actions than those who reported 1 hour of daily use. Now, I want everybody who's listening to me to think about that. If your teenager is on a computer or a phone or any kind of screen for over 5 hours a day, as opposed to under 1 hour a day, they are 70% more likely to want to kill themselves. Now we have to ask ourselves, why? Is that what they're watching on the screen? Is it the medium itself? Is it because they're being sedentary and more isolated? Is it all of the above? But there's something going on with the interaction of screens and the mental health of our children. If we were to break up the different categories of the clinical impacts of screen time, we could very generally break it up into addictive disorders, ADHD and attentional disorders, increased aggression, psychosis, and anxiety and depression. With psychosis, I write about this in my book, Glow Kids. I first entered the field of working with these issues about 12 years ago, when I had a young man who was 16 years old, was sent to my office because he was in a fully psychotic episode. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know where reality ended and where, well, let me back up. He had been playing a game called World of Warcraft, which many of you may be familiar with, which is a fantasy game. And he'd been playing for 10 to 12 hours a night. So he was sleep deprived and been playing for several weeks. So he didn't know where the game ended and reality began. He essentially was in the Matrix. And this young man had no prior history of a psychiatric disorder, no family history of psychiatric issues, but he was fully psychotic. And he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. And unfortunately, he was medicated in ways that he shouldn't have been, because he wasn't genuinely schizophrenic. This was gaming-induced psychosis. If that young man would have unplugged for 2 or 3 days and gotten a good night's sleep, he would have not been reality blurred or dissociated at that point as he was. And so we've seen now, and since in the last 12 years, I've seen many, many, many young people who, because of their immersion in very highly realistic fantasy games and their sleep deprivation around those fantasy games, well, reality itself becomes very blurry and it begins to look like a form of psychosis or a form of schizophrenia. So we began to understand that perhaps our new digital devices were a form of a digital drug, that they were impacting people in ways that we had not fully understood yet. And I wasn't the first person to use the phrase digital heroin. I wrote an article for the New York Post called Digital Heroin in 2016. That got 7 million views and shares. And that was one of the first articles that began to really raise awareness that is our new digital landscape. Are these the new drugs of our generation? And the Chinese have been calling video games electronic heroin for many years. There was an article that came out of the New York Times not too long ago that they talked to a couple of addiction experts nationally. One of them is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And what they looked at was, in the United States, amongst teenagers, recreational drug use had begun to go down, which was a very positive statistic. But what they were suggesting and what they had seen was, is it possible that teenagers were using less psychoactive drugs because now they had found a new drug, a new dopamine-based drug? And that's what part of the thing that we have to understand is that the modern technology and modern screen time is very, what we call dopaminergic, dopamine activating. And some of you may or might not know, but dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. That's the part of the brain that's most associated with any kind of an addiction. Anytime somebody does something that makes them feel good, it releases dopamine, and then people sometimes want to chase that feel-good sensation, and that's what we call the dopamine reward loop. So certain substances like cocaine, obviously they'll raise dopamine in ways that are synthetically very high, and they create habituation, they create addiction. But we discovered now that screen experiences also raise dopamine in ways that mimic drug use. And what's interesting to understand is that dopamine and the release of dopamine, it serves a very important survival function. Evolutionarily, dopamine was released when we ate and when we procreated. And it kept our species alive because it incentivized our eating of food to sustain life, and it incentivized us having children and having sex, because that was also meant to be something that was supposed to be species sustaining. But when we started introducing things like cocaine and digital experiences that raised dopamine without any benefit, that's when we started getting into more significant trouble. There was a study, somewhat older study, back from 1998 that was in Nature magazine that looked at how much dopamine was being stimulated by various activities and various substances. And this study was done by Dr. Cope back in 1998, as I mentioned, and they found that food can raise dopamine 50%, sex can raise dopamine 100%, cocaine 350%, and then the granddaddy of dopamine spiking is crystal meth. Crystal meth raises dopamine the most, which is why we think of crystal meth as one of the most habit-forming substances on the planet, because it has such a high dopamine spiking effect. But the interesting part is, in this 1998 study, they found that video games released as much dopamine as sex. They were 100% dopamine activating. And the more problematic aspect of that was that video games can be played, I don't mean to be crude, I know there might be some children listening as well, but for much longer periods than the sexual experience. So essentially you're releasing dopamine for a much longer period of time. I've worked with gamers who have played nonstop for 2-3 days. And so you're releasing dopamine over an extended period of time and creating this addictive cycle. The other thing that you're doing is that we are changing the neurophysiology of the brain with too much screen time. And one of the most powerful studies that showed this was the 2011 Indiana University School of Medicine study that did fMRI brain imaging on, what was really fascinating about this study was they took young people who weren't gamers, they made them play violent video games for 2 weeks, and they did an fMRI before the study and then fMRI brain imaging after the study. And what did they find? Well, it was fascinating. After just 2 weeks of playing violent video games, they found that brain regions associated with emotion and aggressive behavior were stimulated, and the frontal brain regions that are responsible for addiction and impulse control and self-regulation were directly impacted by this video game playing. And I'll give you a sense of what that looked like. You'll see in these slides, the top 3 slides are the control group, and these were the brains of the young people who did not play video games. And for purposes of these slides, the more orange you see, the better. Orange shows a healthy, robust brain with good activation. And if you look at the bottom 3 slides, those are the 3 slides of a young person who was playing violent video games. And you'll see the orange begins to disappear after 1 week and after 2 weeks. And these are pretty significant changes after such a short period of time. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what happens after 2 years or 20 years of video game playing? What impact are we doing to our children's brains when they're playing for extended periods without a chance to really stimulate their brains in the ways that are healthy for them? Another study that really showed the impact, how powerful screens can be, was done by the US military. The US military had been researching with ways to help combat pain, analgesic, non-medicinal analgesic treatments. Why they were doing that is because, and if you know, the United States likes to get involved in a lot of wars. And after Afghanistan and after Iraq, many soldiers were coming back who had suffered from burns over many large parts of their body. And in fact, there were 2 hospitals, one that I visited in Texas, where they have an entire burn unit of soldiers who have been severely burned. And some of you may or may not know, but to be a burn patient, one of the most painful things is the daily wound care. And typically a lot of burn patients become, a lot of burn patients get given high doses of morphine to tolerate the daily wound care, because what the nurses have to do is they have to scrub off the old dead skin, and that's called debridement. And it's excruciatingly painful to scrub off the dead skin of a burn patient. So they get given high doses of morphine, and essentially many of the burn victims get addicted to the morphine. And so the military was trying to find non-pharmacological ways to deal with pain. And what they found was that if these burn patients were playing a virtual reality game called Snow World, they felt no pain. Now, this is a fantastic innovation for pain management, but it also speaks to how powerfully some of these devices or platforms can be. So at the University of Washington, when they invented this game called Snow World, MRI research showed that the brain centers related to pain were more activated by the game than actual morphine. And I'll show you what that looked like. This is a US soldier who is on the joystick and he has the virtual reality headset on his head, and the nurse is cutting his bandages and attending to his wounds. For Glow Kids, I had the opportunity to interview one of the pilot participants of this program, a patient, an amazing young man called Lieutenant Sam Brown, who had been burned over 70% of his body. And he said to me, Dr. Kardaras, when they gave me morphine, it still hurt like shit. Every day when they had to clean my wounds, it was excruciating. But when I played Snow World, I felt nothing. And again, by the way, this was what Snow World looks like. And this is not some horrific looking game like Grand Theft Auto or something very violent. This was a fairly innocent looking game where the player attempts to throw snowballs at snowmen while Paul Simon music plays in the background. Like I said, it's kind of a happy little game, but it was, again, so powerful to the brain that the brain wasn't processing pain. So what's happening to our kids? Look, here's an engaged young man, and full transparency, this is not his natural coloring. This is through a tint, but what's going on adrenally, hormonally with a young teenage boy like this who's playing a video game and his intensity level is so aroused for multiple hours? Well, essentially when somebody's playing, when young boys, and I don't say this exclusively, but we do see a gender divide in technology usage. Typically young boys tend to be preoccupied with video games, and a disproportionate number of young females tend to be preoccupied with social media. Of course, that's not an absolute, but these are general trends. Essentially, not only is dopamine being activated, but the adrenal response is being activated, or what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And that essentially is our fight or flight response. Now, many of you might know that our fight or flight response, again, was an evolutionary adaptation to protect us, that when we were perceiving danger, we would have an adrenaline release. And typically the adrenaline would be released in our hands and in our feet. So we could either fight or flight, so we could run or fight. And our heart would start pumping and we would send more oxygen to our blood. And we would go through this adrenal process of high activation, high alert. Now, we were only meant to go through that for a short period of time. Typically, we're only meant to go through the fight or flight response for 5 to 10 minutes. We weren't meant to go into high adrenal activation for hours and days and weeks and months, because when you do that for too long, you raise your adrenal thermostat and you go through what's called adrenal fatigue. And that begins to look like PTSD. It begins to look like some not very good things. A lot of the young people that I've worked with, they've been so overly stimulated that it looks like depression, because now they're overstimulated while they're in their gaming platforms, but then the rest of their day-to-day life looks flat and bored. The word that we use in clinical psychology sometimes is anhedonia. Anhedonia is the inability to experience pleasure. And many of you may have teenagers who, I'm bored. This is boring. That's boring, because their digital world has been so immersive, so stimulating, so overly synthetically stimulating that everything else seems boring in comparison. So now attending school, doing chores, doing anything else that used to take focus and time and effort now becomes more challenging because of this instant gratification overstimulation that our children have been exposed to. So this leads also to attentional issues and ADHD. There was one researcher in particular who studied screen effects and ADHD, and that was Dr. Dimitri Christakis. The short of it, I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit, was in 1990, we had found out that if you watch television, for children, for developmentally fragile children, and what that means is children are the most neurologically fragile from the ages of 2 to 6. And That's why when a child can learn the language so easily when they're younger, because their brain is malleable and growing. That's also when our children develop their ability to have good attention and be able to focus. And that's when they develop their active imagination and their creativity. Well, what happens to young kids when they're exposed or overexposed to what's called high impact stimulation, like a video game or like too much screen time? Well, what happens is it increases their dependence on needing stimulation to stay engaged. So you create a habituation or an addiction to something always being exciting. And what that looks like is ADHD, because now, unless the child is being overly stimulated, he can't or she can't keep their focus. And so we found out in 1990 that for every hour of television viewing that a 2 to 6-year-old was on, they would increase their ADHD rate by 10%. So if a 4-year-old watched 3 hours of television a day, they would have 30% higher rates of ADHD. When Dr. Christakis did that research again in 2010 with an iPad with an interactive, immersive screen, he found that effect was greatly increased. So the more screen time we give to children at younger ages, the more we're increasing the likelihood of them developing an attentional disorder like ADHD, which significantly increased that. There's also been a lot of research, and I won't get into the details, of being immersed in violent video games and increasing aggression and potentially violence. I'm going to skip over these next couple of slides because these are a couple of American cases of young teenagers who have committed, who had hurt their parents, committed violence when their screen devices were taken away. The other thing that I write about in my new book, is coming out in September, called Digital Madness. Things like extremism and extremist groups targeting our vulnerable, empty, lost teenagers and into ideological brainwashing. And so the FBI in the United States, I've spoken to them, they've been actively recruiting through everything from gaming platforms to Instagram and other digital and YouTube to recruit. That's everything from white supremacist groups to Islam. They're actively recruiting young people who are looking for a sense of belonging. A lot of our lost young people are just looking for a sense of belonging. And one of the most extreme examples of that was this young man, Corey Johnson. This young man, I was an expert witness in his court case. He was he committed a very horrific murder. He tried to kill several people, but he essentially wound up almost decapitating a 13-year-old neighbor of his. It's a horrific story. I won't get into all of the details of it, other than the fact that this used to be a sweet young kid. And essentially he was a little bit bullied in school, a little bit of a loner, and he was obsessed with YouTube. And as we know, the way that social media platforms operate, the way the algorithms work, they feed us what we want to see in a more extremified sense. It's called an extremification loop. So as many of you know, if you're shopping for a pair of shoes, your digital world will start feeding you more and more shoes because it feeds you what it thinks you're interested in, and it tends to intensify that. So if you're watching a YouTube video about a cat, you're going to start getting fed YouTube cat videos and more extreme cat videos. So this young man was politically interested, and he used to be a progressive liberal when he was 15 years old. But then he happened to watch a YouTube video about the Holocaust. And because he watched that short video about the Holocaust, the YouTube algorithm started sending him different videos about Holocaust denying videos, and then neo-Nazi videos, and then white supremacy videos. So within 6 months, this sweet left-wing progressive kid became a neo-Nazi. Well, the story gets more interesting from there, because then he happened to watch a YouTube video. And by the way, all he did was watch YouTube videos all day long. He would stay in his room. His mother was a single mother. His father had died when he was younger. And all he did was watch YouTube videos. So after he became a white supremacist for a few months, he watched randomly a video about Syria and Assad. And because he watched that, they started sending him ISIS videos and ISIS recruitment videos. And within several months, he changed his name, he became converted to Islam, and he became an ISIS warrior and committed one of the most horrific crimes. I don't want to get into the details of the crime. If you want to look it up, you could see Corey Johnson. You could Google the story, but I testified as an expert witness in his murder defense because the defense essentially argued that it was an insanity defense, that this young man was driven insane and brainwashed, ideologically brainwashed by his immersion into YouTube, and that he was incapable of not getting brainwashed because of the nefarious and insidious nature of the algorithms. His defense team didn't expect him to be acquitted, and he wasn't. He's got sentenced to life in prison, but he was facing the death sentence. We still have the death sentence in the United States. I don't know if you have the death sentence in Chile, but it was a pretty interesting ordeal. I interviewed this young man in prison for 4 hours, and it was 9 months after the initial attacks. And so because of COVID, his court was delayed because of COVID. And it was interesting because when I met him in prison, it was very unnerving. I went back and I told my wife, after I'd seen the crime photos, I was expecting to meet a sociopath, an insane young man. And what I met was a sweet kid who felt a great deal of remorse for the crimes that he had committed. And that was what was the most unsettling to me, because when he was in prison at that point, he had been off of computers and the internet and social media for 9 months. So he went back to his normal pre-brainwashed self, which, as I mentioned earlier, had been a pretty sweet kid. And at the time of the murders, they said he was walking around almost like a zombie. He had been so indoctrinated and so brainwashed. So these are strange new examples of what can happen in the digital age. Social media, I talked quite a bit about the depression effect. The biggest driver, one of the biggest drivers of depression is something called the comparison effect with social media. Essentially, any of us who are on social media, whether it be us old timers on Facebook or younger people on something like TikTok or Instagram, the social comparison effect essentially says that we're comparing ourselves to the idealized digital selves of all of our quote unquote friends on our social media platforms. And so they become a reflective mirror back on our own lives. And so if I'm going through a difficult period in my life, and if I'm feeling pretty depressed about my life, and I have 500 Facebook friends, and I keep seeing happy vacation photo after happy vacation photo, it only amplifies my sense of perhaps my life isn't what it should be. It makes me feel worse about myself rather than better about myself. And it doesn't give me a connection to those friends in the way that I need it. It gives me a counterfeit, illusory sense of connection. My 500 friends on Facebook aren't really my friends. They're just digital avatars that I have no real connection with. What we found in the psychological research is that we need face-to-face social interaction for it to have a psychological and emotional benefit for us. The digital interaction it's not the same. It doesn't increase our social and emotional well-being in any sense compared to face-to-face. And we saw that during coronavirus, that people's depression rates went through the roof because of that. And this was no shock, by the way. The people who invented social media were very well aware of this. Facebook's first president, Sean Parker, he was the founder of the media app. I can't even remember the name of it now. I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember the name of the music app that he had first developed. But Sean Parker has now quit Facebook and gave an interview not too long ago where he talked about Facebook literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. The inventors, the creators, it's me, it's Zuckerberg, Kevin Systrom, and Instagram. It's all of these people. We understood this consciously, he said, and we did it anyway. The point being is that social media isn't addicting by accident. They were made habit forming by design. And And while we can understand that, many companies try to sell their products by marketing, and we've always had things like jingles and people trying to come up with catchy ways to sell their products, now we're using behavior modification techniques on children that we've never seen anything like this in terms of how to manipulate kids to stay engaged. It's in Silicon Valley, they call it the battle for the eyeballs. But as I mentioned earlier, now we're not just seeing tech addiction or social media addiction, we're seeing psychiatric disorders. One of the most fascinating examples, and I'm going to start winding it down, has been in the last year and a half, there was a phenomenon here in the United States called TikTok Tourette's. And what was happening was there were hundreds, there were a couple of thousand of teenage girls who were beginning to show symptoms of Tourette's disorder. And their pediatricians were confused about this because normally Tourette's disorder, so for those of you who don't know, it's a tic disorder. And if you have Tourette's syndrome, usually you either have facial tics or your bodily tics, your movements. Sometimes you could have verbal tics. People with Tourette's syndrome will sometimes curse. They'll have a yelp or they'll curse. So Tourette's disorder is a neurological disorder that has physiological manifestations. It's fairly rare, and it typically affects boys more than girls. It's 75% male, 25% female. And yet all of a sudden there was an epidemic of teenage girls who were developing Tourette's disorder in the last year and a half. So their pediatricians started looking into it, and they found out that all these young women were following 3 social media influencers on TikTok who had Tourette's disorder. And in fact, these Tourette's influencers had over 2 billion views on their sites. And what started happening was that the women who were followers of these Tourette's influencers started manifesting symptoms of Tourette's disorder. Now, whether they were doing it consciously or unconsciously, that's an open question. I think that's still to be determined. But I studied some of the videos of the influencers, and they looked like they didn't generally have Tourette's disorders. They looked performative, as if they were, well, let's put it this way. Who gets the most attention on social media? Which influencers? Well, it's the influencers who are the most over the top, whose behavior tends to be the largest. And so influencers now seem to be getting hardwired to become as performative, as over the top as possible. So were these tic disorder influencers generally have themselves Tourette's? I don't think so. But we see that it was spreading virtually and digitally like a virus. We also saw that with dissociative disorder. On this slide, you'll see DID systems. Dissociative disorder we used to call multiple personality disorder. So very rare. Historically, it was very rare. Typically, it would be children who had been sexually abused would sometimes, very rarely, develop alternate identities, alternate personalities. That would, the theory would go that they couldn't handle the abuse psychologically, and they would create an alter identity in which they would compartmentalize the abuse in one of the other identities. But typically it would be 3, 4, 5 identities. Now we're seeing online on TikTok, we're seeing people with multiple personality disorder with over 100 identities, the full LGBTQI spectrum. So you'll have a host, they're called hosts now, or they're called systems, who will be the main person, let's call them the main person, the host body, and they'll have a 40-year-old Black lesbian identity. They'll have a 30-year-old heterosexual white. They'll have a 12-year-old Hispanic boy. But literally dozens and dozens and dozens of identities. And as I said before, there's a performative aspect. And now they have followers who are watching for the moment that they do what's called switching, when the influencer, the dissociative or the multiple personality influencer will switch from one identity to the next. That's called switching. And that's when their followers are the most enraptured by some of these influencers. It's a very strange new phenomenon. It's getting very popular. And we've also seen the spike in personality disorders, borderline personality disorder in particular, which tends to be typified by a lot of black and white thinking, high reactivity, we've seen, I was a professor at university for 10 years, and we started seeing our younger people started getting more and more reactive, more and more emotionally dysregulated, less able to handle day-to-day reality, opposing views. We're seeing it in the polarization of our politics. And I'm theorizing that social media, because it's in social media's DNA, is black and white polarity, because black and white polarity is what drives engagement. When someone's emotional reactivity is triggered by social media, that's when you tend to watch something more. If something is boring or gray, it doesn't get any views or followers. But if something is intensely arousing emotionally, and what's intensely arousing emotionally but emotional extremism, political extremism, ideological extremism, behavioral extremism. And so is it possible that that extremism is beginning to shape the way that young people are processing their day-to-day information? And based on the many, many, many young people that my clinics and I treat, we're seeing a huge increase in these types of black and white types of reactive disorders, personality disorders that are happening. And again, it's a very fascinating phenomenon to see. And what's interesting from a treatment standpoint, when you unplug those young people in treatment, if they're in residential treatment for several weeks and they're not exposed to social media, you'll see their psychiatric symptoms usually dissipate. And that's the proof, at least for me, that the toxin is the social media toxin. That's what's driving the psychiatric illness. Not always, I'm not saying this is always the case, but I think it's responsible for the large spike. I'm going to jump through this a little bit because I don't want to get too much into it, but in psychology, we know the Werther effect. The Werther effect are when things happen in clusters, when people tend to mimic other people in doing things. So we know that there are things called social contagions, things that are spread through social means, like smoking. Smoking cigarettes is a social contagion. If your friends smoke, you're more likely to smoke. We know that suicides happen in clusters and can be social contagions. So the Werther effect, it's based on there was a Goethe novel back in 1774, and it described a young man who was a spurned lover, who essentially was very romantic, poetic, and he committed a very dramatic suicide. And back in the 1770s, the publishing of this book led to an outbreak of copycats. And it was called the Werther effect, or Werther fever, they actually called it, where men, young men all throughout Europe started dressing like this character in the book and started committing suicide because they so identified with him. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of digital Werther effects, that there are groups online that are creating copycat types of behavior and are getting young people who are looking for connection, looking for groups to feel a sense of belonging to. This has to do with school shootings, and Columbine here in the United States was the turning point. You know, as you may know, in Chile, we have school shooting epidemics here that are out of control, and the Homeland Security here is suspecting, as I am, that a lot of this is being festered online, that a lot of these school shooters get notoriety, they get followers, and then people sort of then copycat that behavior. They become almost, they become influencers. They become toxic influencers. And John Cohen from the Department of Homeland Security said that Columbine, that absolutely influenced all the post-Columbine shootings. They go online, they look at past attacks, and in a perverse way, they connect with not only past incidents, but past attackers. So we're seeing that there could be some very toxic negative spreads. I'm going to skip over the educational part about screens in the classroom, other than this one slide. I think this one is relevant, extremely relevant. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that the one most important predictor for a child's success in their life is their love of reading. And the OECD, which is the Economic Cooperation and Development, they're a global study group. They found that competency in reading at age 7 and love of reading at age 15 were the biggest predictors of lifelong success. And what we know is that screen time destroys a child's love of reading. And in fact, according to research, kids who read on screens are 3 times less likely to say they enjoy reading. And I just showed you the one study that looked at the love of reading is the most important thing that we can do for our children, helping develop their love of reading, helping them develop their imagination. But what screen time does is it drops a nuclear bomb on the passion for reading. It drops a nuclear bomb on creativity. So I'm not gonna, I think I've thrown a lot of information, so I don't want to sort of belabor. There are a couple of other slides that are more clinical. They look at treatment and some of those things. I kind of want to, because I would like to open it up to questions. Well, this slide, things to look for if you think your child or teenager has screen issues, and it's looking at how is their screen time affecting the other parts of their lives. Is your child or loved one, are they doing the things that they used to love doing less? If they used to play sports, are they not playing sports anymore? If they used to play an instrument, are they not playing an instrument anymore? Sleep deprivation. We see that sleep deprivation is often correlated with screen issues. Personal hygiene tends to suffer, less bathing tends to go on. But generally speaking, you'll see the grades going down, and then you'll see a lot of emotional dysregulation. You'll see a lot of reactivity, nuclear temper tantrums, the young people that will be explosive when their screens are taken away. Let's skip over tech addiction treatment. And these are just some tips that are, I think, helpful suggestions for parents and families. Is the one best thing that we can do for our children is to delay screen time as much as possible, at the very least age 10. I also, by the way, have 15-year-old twin boys, so I'm in this struggle. I know what it's like to raise teenagers in this society. It's challenging because everybody is swimming in technology, and how do you help your child not feel left out if while their friends have devices? So we could talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. Parents, practice what you preach. Watch and moderate your own tech habits. Definitely no screens at the dinner table. And if at all possible, try to have conversations at the dinner table. Engage dialectical conversation, stimulation at the dinner. I try to do this with my family. The 1 day a week fast is that 1 day a week, unplug all the devices, the entire family, and go outdoors or do something together. Do something that's not related to any type of technology, so you can reset both your own. I find it refreshing to reset at least once a week. Talk to your children early and often about what technology may or may not be doing to them, how it may impact them. Have conversations with them about them. Don't be afraid to talk to your children about your concerns about their involvement in technology. But there's one thing to have open dialogue, and there's another thing just to be prescriptive and finger wagging. And obviously no teenagers like to be told what to do, but teenagers do respond to data, to studies. And what I find in my treatment program, when I treat young people, they don't like to feel that they're being manipulated by big tech. And sometimes when we show them some of the algorithm techniques that big tech uses to manipulate young people into being increasing consumers of their products, they get angry. And I try to use that anger, like, yeah, what? I'm being manipulated by this gaming company, or I'm being manipulated by Facebook or Instagram. And so you develop a sense of, you try to foster that sense of independence for your child, to not feel that they're going to be part of the sheep that are being manipulated. Foster balanced, emotionally strong children, and that's volunteerism and working collaboratively in different opportunities that they can in school or outside of school. Healthy hobbies are key. You can't just take away your child's device and have them sit in a room staring at the wall. You have to stimulate them in other ways, whether it's through art or music or nature. Nature is the single biggest antidote. And oftentimes, families that I work with, if they can't send their children to treatment, or if they're not able to do a digital detox and unplug their kids, the next best thing is camp or nature, going away to a nature retreat. Sending your child to a camp for 2 weeks is an excellent way to unplug them and to recalibrate them into a healthier, more balanced way. So that's, I want to, and by the way, that's my treatment program in Austin, Texas, and I also have one in Hawaii, and we also have a program in New York. But I'll wind it down with that, and I'll open up the floor if anybody has any questions about anything that we just discussed.
Well, thank you.
Stop sharing my screen.
Yeah,
Yes.
we have a lot of questions. There's been a lot of debate here on the chat, and I don't know where to start really, because it's so many.
Yo quiero un minuto, Mónica, un minuto.
Dale.
Solamente agradecer al doctor Kardaras, agradecer a cada uno de los participantes y también motivar e incentivar a la postura de absorber el conocimiento sin querer demostrar que lo que él dijo comprueba mi postura, que lo que él mencionó es exactamente lo opuesto porque no citó el otro estudio, sino que tener una actitud donde una persona dice algo, ¿no verdad? Y querer de verdad recibir ese conocimiento para poder engrandar mi cabeza, mi mente, la forma de educación de los niños, de la misma forma como quizá yo no escuché todas las recomendaciones porque quería enfatizar el punto que anterior dijo porque refuerza mi forma de pensamiento. Creo que es importante, ¿no es verdad?, que nosotros tengamos como papás, como mamás, la opción de incorporar miradas sin querer demostrar justamente que eso muestra o no muestra lo que yo pienso, lo que yo creo. Acá no es una amenaza, no es un reforzamiento, es un espacio de crecimiento en todo lo que es mi aprendizaje. Y por querer muchas veces demostrar esto y lo otro, se puede perder ese espacio. Por lo tanto, en este espacio de preguntas, ¿no es verdad?, de creación y desarrollo de conocimiento, yo invito a absorber lo que el profesor pueda decir, responder preguntas, pero no querer demostrar mi punto, más que eso, solamente eso, es que justamente lo que el profesor muchas veces decía, que las redes sociales hacen eso, que nos pongamos un poco como más extremistas, más llevados a nuestra idea. Yo creo que justamente es el concepto, ¿no es verdad? Acá el doctor habló un punto y me parece ahora que también va a hablar de la relevancia que tiene quizás la regulación, más que la prohibición. Ahí hay que escuchar. Yo estoy tratando de estar atento a lo que él decía, pero muchas veces con todas las opiniones del chat, que está bien que sean, como que uno se perdía. Yo invito por eso a focalizarnos, ¿no es verdad?, en esta actitud crítica de querer escuchar, entender, conocer. Y te dejo, bueno, Mónica iba a tener con la Fer, no sé si hasta las 2 o 1, van a tener ahí una dura pega, pero yo invitaría a eso, quizás partir por recomendaciones positivas de regulación, como un poco lo que estaba hablando, y quizás después ir metiendo ahí, las dejo a ustedes. Así que, bueno.
¿Quieres partir tú? Porque de verdad we have a lot of questions, so. Yeah.
Hay varias preguntas en relación a cuánto es el uso adecuado para cierto tipo de edades. Por ejemplo, preescolares, más middle school y high school. Esa pregunta se repitió bastante. ¿Cuál es el tiempo que tú recomiendas o sugieres que es adecuado para los niños?
Yeah, so I do get that question a lot. And the other question is, how long, how often, 2 hours, what age? And so I have to say that every child is different. There are some children that are going to be more vulnerable to screen impacts because they may already have some developmental issues We know that children on the spectrum with autism, they have more vulnerability to screen time issues. There are some children who are already more predisposed to having attentional ADHD type of issues. So let me start off by saying that. So there's not a black and white guideline recommendation, but generally speaking, the older the children are before they get exposed to screen time, the more their brain will have time to develop to be able to handle powerful technology. So let me give you just one interesting bit of information for everybody listening. Sergey Brin and Larry Page, because the number one thing, by the way, that I hear from parents is if we don't give technology to our children young, they're going to fall behind, right? All these other children are going to be on their tablets, and my kid is going to be playing with a stick, and he's not going to get into university. So Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who founded Google, were Montessori students, never had technology until they were in high school. Jeff Bezos from Amazon, a Montessori student, never had technology till he was in high school. And of course, we've all heard the Steve Jobs story. Steve Jobs never let his children have iPads because they understood the most powerful brains in technology understood that the later we wait to give our children technology, the better. So I love my automobile, I love my car, but I don't give my children the car keys until they're old enough to handle the technology. So the older, the better. Typically we'll say like so I will say that we recommend generally things like smartphones. There's a movement in the United States called wait until eighth grade. So that's 13. That's what I did with my kids. I waited, they got a modified dumb phone at 13, but no gaming. My young boys I didn't let them do any gaming. I kept them engaged. So as little as possible in preschool, almost no technology in preschool. Sometimes you're going to have to learn how to use a keyboard and on a desktop computer in elementary school. So at ages 8, 9, 10, you start learning how to use a keyboard, but not individual devices, not smartphones and not iPads, not until middle school, 13, 14.
And another thing related to that, is it the same to be using, so you talk about screens, but it's a bit different when you work with the screens than when you play with the screens, so you're using social media. So is there a difference there on what you were saying on the impact that it has on the brain?
Yeah, so if you're watching a nature documentary or if you're having a Zoom with your grandmother, is different than playing Grand Theft Auto or doing some of the other. So if we look at screen time as a continuum, and again, I hate to do this, but I do analogize it with drug use. So cannabis, marijuana is not the same as crystal meth, but they're all problematic because all screen time is hyper arousing, stimulating, dopaminergic, but you're correct, some of the content does make some screen experiences more problematic than others. Some social media is, as we know, increases mental health issues. I didn't even get into the Instagram and eating disorders. The Facebook whistleblower came out a few months ago, Frances Haugen, who worked at Facebook, and she indicated Facebook's own internal research indicated that eating disorders and suicide rates went up on Instagram because it targeted vulnerabilities of teenage girls, because the algorithm targeted that. And so I would say that that's fairly toxic if you have a platform that attacks your emotional vulnerability to make you feel worse about yourself. That's certainly worse than watching, a Disney cartoon or something like that.
And the other question that is repeated a lot is basically, I'm going to make one out of a lot of them, is school versus home. Or I don't know if versus, but basically school role here, or guidelines for school in different ages. For example, for high school or for the little ones. What would you recommend there? Because
so that's a significant problem, because we can try to be the best, most tech cautious parents on the planet, but if the school gives my child a Chromebook or a tablet when they're 5, then it undermines what I'm trying to do at home. So a lot of times the schools are not in alignment with the parents. And I find, because I work a lot with school systems, I do a lot of education conference talks. A lot of school administrators have been fooled. In the US, we have a phrase, they've drank the Kool-Aid. They will say, and they're competing with other school districts. Well, that school district, they got Chromebooks in 7th grade. We're going to get Chromebooks in 4th grade and in 3rd grade. And it's a false narrative that the more technology in the classroom is better educational outcomes. And what we've seen is just the opposite. In Finland is always in the top 3 of countries with the best educational outcomes. And the Minister of Education in Finland has said, no individualized screens in the classroom. They have smart boards, but they don't allow phones, tablets, because they know it's a distraction. Screens in the classroom are a distraction. As much as we say it's for education, kids are going to be on social media, they're going to be doing it. They're very rarely are used for the correct thing in the classroom. The best, when I speak at education conferences, I've challenged educators to show me one study that shows that a screen has any benefit educationally, because we know that the best benefit educationally is the Socratic dialectic. An educated professor in a circle doing a question and answer, back and forth debate, learning how to use critical thinking. But screen-based learning, where you read a module and then you answer a few questions, then you go to the next module, and then you answer a few questions and you go to the next module, without the interaction of a professor or a teacher, is nowhere near as effective. So I encourage parents to be vocal to their schools, to pump the brakes, as we say in the United States, and slow down the screens in terms of how old they are. Because 10 years ago, we were giving tablets only to high school students. And now, then there was middle school, then there was primary school, then there was kindergarten, then there was preschool. And we need to say, no. Let's keep it at a certain age. And so there is a movement here in the United States where some of the best private schools are definitely slowing down the age that they're giving tablets to their children.
Now, another question, and something a bit different, but they were also asking if screens or all this affects the brain of the adults as well, because studies focus on the youngsters or little ones, but what happens with adults? Does it change too?
Us old graybeards who have our fully developed brain. So where the young people are more vulnerable is their prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the executive functioning part of our brain, where where our decision-making lives, it's where our impulse control lives. That part keeps growing until we're in our mid-20s. So when we expose kids to screens too much, the number one thing we're doing is we're priming them for impulsivity. We're making a generation of highly impulsive kids. But the adults, our brains also can get affected. Not so much the prefrontal cortex, but they found these interesting studies. Dr. Bartzokis, who was a UCLA neurologist, found this with chronic substance abuse, because they found this with screen time and chronic substance abuse. It affects the myelin sheath, the white matter of the brain. So all of our brains have axons and neuronal connections, and they're connected with the myelin sheath is a white lipid that connects all. It's like the insulation cable of our brains. And what they found with chronic drug use and excessive screen time is the myelin sheath, the insulation cable in our brains, becomes more brittle and more porous, and there's less connectivity in our brains. And that happens into our 30s, 40s, and 50s. The other thing that they found in London, at the London School of Economics, they did a really fascinating study about memory. Because, you know, when we become overly dependent on technology, we as human beings, some of our skills atrophy, right? Remember when we were children, if you got a calculator in math, you began to forget how to multiply, because now you use your calculator to multiply for you, so you forget your multiplication tables. Well, now we found that memory as adults begins to atrophy, because we've outsourced our memory to our smartphones. And so when I do lectures, I'll ask the room, how many of you can tell me 10 phone numbers? How many of you anybody in the room tell me 10 phone numbers? And 15 years ago, everybody knew everybody's phone number. We remembered everybody's phone number. Now our smartphones have everybody's phone number. And they did a study, I mentioned the London School of Economics. Do you know in London, they have to give an exam. It's a memorization exam for cab drivers, and it's called the knowledge. And to be a cab driver in London is one of the most difficult exams. Okay, you're nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. Typically, they study for 4 or 5 years to pass this exam, and they have to memorize thousands of streets, which are very unique and arcane. They did an MRI on their brains before they studied the preparation for this exam and 4 years afterwards. And those who passed the exam, who were in their 30s and 40s and 50s, they saw a huge growth in their hippocampus. And so the hippocampus and the amygdala are the memory parts of our brain that even into our 40s, we can make our hippocampus grow, because anytime we use our memory, it strengthens that part of our brain. So it's kind of a use it or lose it mindset. That's why they say with seniors that have dementia or Alzheimer's, they should be playing Sudoku or crossword puzzles. So those of us who are adults, if we're not using our memory as much, if we're becoming more reliant on our technology, it does begin to atrophy parts of our brain, even into adulthood. It's a long answer to your short question.
No, but it's really important. And basically, a lot of people are asking because they have to work in front of screens, I don't know, 9 hours, 8 hours. And basically, again, it can affect because it's a screen or it's what they're doing with the screens.
Well, we should definitely take breaks. I mean, I have to be in front of a computer a lot too. So
Yeah.
like anything else, you know, now they have ergonomic desks where you could stand, and it's definitely good to take at least a 15-minute break periodically, because the one thing that we need to do is we definitely need to kind of breathe, take a walk, sort of, you know, get away from the constant exposure. So even if we do have to work on the computer all day, we have to be mindful of taking some breaks away from that. Both for our eyes as well, by the way, just for ocular
yes.
reasons, also for mental reasons too.
See, we blink less when we're watching the
Yeah.
They were asking about the name of the book because you have, ¿cierto? Fernanda, dale.
See, the last question, do you have any suggestion about what to do when you haven't managed to keep your child away from screen, but your children's friends use screen frequently?
What to do if you want to have your kid, but meanwhile their friends are in front of screens frequently? Yeah, it's extremely challenging if your children's peer groups. That's why I know families here in the United States, they will take their children out of a particular school and put them in let's call it a more evolved low-tech schools where the other peers are going to be more likely to be I don't want to sound elitist about this, but more evolved families who understand what technology is doing, because it's going to be extremely difficult because of social learning theory. If your son is hanging out with 10 gamers, your son is going to be a gamer, or he's going to feel extremely left out. So it's important to find other kids who are playing sports, doing music, and having them connect that way, or else it'll be very difficult. Oh, and the new book, by the way, you were asking me, the new book is Digital Madness, and the subtitle is How Social Media is Driving Our Mental Health Crisis.
Perfect. And that's going to be out soon, you said. That's not.
It's on Amazon. I know the devil of Amazon, but it's on Amazon for advance order, and it's out in September.
Okay, but you had another book as well. Is it in Spanish or it's only in English?
Glow Kids is also in Spanish. Glow Kids is in 12 languages. It's in Chinese, it's in Spanish, French. It's not in Greek. It's not in my native language, Greek, but it's in 12 languages.
So you have to translate it now.
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of more things to go, but basically I would say we have to read now, and we've been kind of an hour and a half, a bit more than that, watching the screen. So maybe we should take a break. No sé, Daniel.
You know, I would like to kind of maybe conclude by saying it's all happened so rapidly. This change in our society has happened so rapidly. And, you know, my father passed away about 2.5 years ago. And I write about this in the new book. The first chapter of my new book is my father died, was an older Greek immigrant raised in World War II Greece, and in a very in a mountain village, very close to nature, planted trees, no running water, lived with a profound connection with nature. My father did, and was dying of cancer painfully in New York, and would look at me, and he would say, "Nico, the way that you're living today, the way that we are living today, this was not the way that human beings were meant to live." You know, my father was an anachronism. He was from a different time and a different place. And he stuck to his old way of thinking. And I would tell him about some of the clients that I'm working with and some of the things that are happening. And he would look at me and say, "Nico, this is not the way." And there was quite a bit of wisdom to understand that this shock wave that we've all been through that feels so normal for all of us, if somebody would have told any of us 20 years ago that we're going to be living most of our lives online in front of a screen in this very unnatural way of being, we would have told them that they were crazy. This was science fiction. I mean, we're living in a science fiction reality almost. And so we have to remember what it means to be human in terms of how to connect with each other, how to find meaning in our lives, how to find that sense of authentic life, which I think we've been lulled and dulled out of. Because when you're just getting so information overloaded, you forget what it means to be truly human and to be compassionate and to live a life of meaning. And that's why I think so many of our young people feel so empty. And what do they fill the emptiness with? Like any addiction, you feed the emptiness with something outside of yourself.
I was taking notes of the last thing you said. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Bueno, y también muchas gracias a ti, Mónica, a Fernanda, que estuvieron acompañándonos con las preguntas, por supuesto a Nicolás, y a cada uno y una de ustedes la invitación siempre es adquirir nuevo conocimiento, a ver cómo como papás, como mamás lo podemos hacer mejor, cómo podemos, ¿no es verdad?, generar ese nuevo aprendizaje que en este caso en particular fue con respecto a tomar una mayor conciencia del tiempo de uso de pantallas, la forma de uso, con una enciclopedia que trae detrás el doctor Kardaras, y que, por supuesto, la idea también es aplicarlo en nuestras distintas comunidades educativas. Así que, querido Nicolás, no sé si tienes algún último pensamiento de despedida. Yo si no,
just immense gratitude for the opportunity to speak to your community, and I could just read that you're all really caring. Thank you for hosting this event. Caring, wonderful people. Thank you.
Bueno, así que con ese agradecimiento, agradecemos a cada uno y una de ustedes. Les deseamos que tengan unas muy buenas tardes, excelente noche, y los dejo invitados para la primera semana de junio, que vamos a tener a un doctor de Harvard, que es el primero que desarrolló toda una nueva metodología para el tema de videojuegos. Cómo sacar muchas veces a niños y niñas de videojuegos. El doctor Alo Caloja, que nos va a estar acompañando, al igual como estuvo el doctor Kardaras hoy día. Así que ya están invitados. Muchos cariños y saludos para cada uno de ustedes. Hasta luego. Que les vaya muy bien.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Tú cierras.
Bueno.